Good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Farron, Curator of Education here at the Fleming Museum, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our talk today. But before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the Center for Research on Vermont, which does so much to promote scholarly research on Vermont and to make it available to a wider audience. So I'd like to thank them for co-sponsoring today's talk. And Richard Watts, the director, is over there, so thank you very much. First, I will introduce Teresa Mares, and I had the pleasure of meeting Teresa just this morning when she brought her food and culture class to one of our current exhibits, Eat the Social Life of Food, and that's really the impetus for some of the programming we've been doing around food. This was an honors college course, Introduction to Museum Studies, and the student curators actually put the show together. So we'll be having more talks. So I hope, it seems like you're all very interested in this topic, so we hope we'll see you again at a future program. So Teresa Mares is an assistant professor of anthropology here at UVM, and she's affiliated with the Transdisciplinary Research Initiative in Food Systems. She received her BA in Anthropology and Foreign Languages and Literature with a concentration in Spanish from Colorado State University, and she went on to get her master's and PhD from the University of Washington. Dr. Mares' research focuses on the intersection of food and migration, and she is particularly interested in the ways that diets and foodways of Latino immigrants change as a result of that migration. Recent articles include, here we have the Food Bank, Latin Immigration and the Contradictions of Emergency Food, which was published in Food and Foodways, Tracing Immigrant Identity Through the Plate and the Palate in Latino Studies, and she co-authored a chapter in the edited food volume, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, which was published in 2011. Our second speaker today is Pablo Bose, who is an assistant professor of geography here at UVM. He received his BA in English from the University of British Columbia and his master's in communication from Simon Fraser University, and his PhD in environmental studies from York University. Dr. Bose is particularly interested in the food practices of immigrants, what they carry with them, what they attempt to recreate in new settings, and how they are transformed by the food culture of the new settings they find themselves in. He has a series of ongoing projects that examine migrant communities and the locations of their resettlement in places like our own Chittenden County. Articles include Mapping Movements, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Migration Research, which was published in the Handbook of Research Methods in Migration in 2012. Another article, Home and Away, Diasporas, Developments, and Displacements in a Globalizing World. And he co-edited Developments, Displacements, Ecologies, Economies, and Cultures at Risk, a result of a multi-year, multi-country study of various forms of development and population displacement. So we're really lucky that we could have two speakers of this caliber here today to explore this really interesting topic. Today, Dr. Mares and Dr. Bose will be speaking about the research on food and migration in Vermont, particularly their involvement with two community projects, one that works with refugees on urban farming and another that works with migrant workers on kitchen gardening. And the title of their talk today is Eating Far from Home, Migrant Foodways in Vermont. So please join me in welcoming them to the Fleming Museum.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you so much to the Fleming for organizing this. I had to put this picture of corn up to block my really ugly desktop, so I'll bring my own presentation up. And I think, when I was first approached about doing this talk, I was really excited to collaborate with Pablo on this because we've been talking a lot about some of the things that we're seeing in common between our projects and some of the things that are very different in terms of the work that we're doing. And so today what I'm going to be really talking about is very much an applied project. For the past 2 years, I've been working along with my collaborator, Naomi Wolcott-McCausland, who is also here today, on a very applied project that is dealing with food security among Latino migrant workers in the state. And I'm at the point right now where I'm sort of moving into more of the research hat, and so what I'll be talking about is mostly about where my research is hopefully going to be headed and how this is hopefully going to connect with some of the work that we've been doing. So the sort of central contradiction, what I sense as sort of my, maybe not my life's work, but at least my life until post-tenure, hopefully, knock on wood, is going to be is this discussion of sort of why is it that people that are most responsible for putting food on our plates, whether it is in factory farms, whether it is in slaughterhouses, whether it is in dairies, why are those individuals often some of the most hungry individuals in our country? And that to me, this is a really fundamentally strange contradiction about a food system that feeds so many but also doesn't feed so many. And so if we look at studies of food security among Latino migrant workers, studies in areas where there has been sort of longer patterns of migration, places in North Carolina, California, and along the US-Mexico border, there are studies that have found that farm workers experience food insecurity rates anywhere between 3 and 4 times the national average. And the national average right now is between 14 and 15%. So that means that between possibly 45 to 60% of farm workers are not getting enough food on a regular basis. And to me, this is just very fundamentally strange. And hopefully through my research, I'll be thinking about some possible ways to ameliorate this. So what's also really important to consider is that these numbers are often higher among families with children, and so families with young children experience food insecurity rates that are even oftentimes more severe than this. So what I'll be talking about is giving you some insight into this emerging research project that's integrated with a project called Huertas, which is an applied project that is coordinated by UVM Extension. And while there hasn't been data yet, I think I've learned a lot about some of the context that we're seeing in the state, and hopefully we'll share that with you today. I will share it, not hopefully, I will be sharing it. So if we think about, I think one of the other things that I really think that Pablo and I share in common is that this notion of foodways, which is very much sort of an anthropological, social scientific term about how people eat in a place or a time, it really gets pushed to the borders and the boundaries when we're thinking about migrant populations and thinking about how people bring food in the form of seeds or cans of mole from very far away into the United States. And this shows us a lot about what people find is important. So thinking about some basic facts, and there's been some great work that's been done here at the University of Vermont by Dan Baker in CDAE around healthcare access within this community. We can state with pretty good certainty that there's probably about 12 to 1,500 Latino migrant workers in the state, and most of these are men, but there's also women present and some young and not so young children present as well. And that in relationship to the overall population of the state, the Latino population is growing. And again, we're in Vermont, so everything per capita is a little bit of a different question. But that population has grown quite a bit in the first decade of the 2000s. And if we're thinking about what Vermont looks like in some of the demographics of our state, we have just become the whitest state in the country. We just swapped with Maine. Go figure. And so when people are out on the landscape, when people are present in public, they're very much visible. And I think that the visibility and the invisibility question of these communities is really important in thinking about issues of food access and food security. So in Vermont, we can see that there's a large percentage of our milk, anywhere from a quarter to a half of the milk in the state is produced by migrant workers, and as many as 2/3 of the dairies in the state have migrant workers on them. But this is often, again, a very invisible community within Vermont. So in terms of milk, milk's big here, and I'm just now getting a sense of how big milk is. Vermont is the most dependent state on dairy production in the US, and that what we've seen in Vermont, as well as other places that have a very heavy presence of the dairy industry, is that farms are getting bigger, but they're getting fewer. And so this process of consolidation is also sort of paralleling a similar process of increased Latino migrant labor on dairies, whether it's in Wisconsin and California or Vermont. And so what we're seeing here is a sort of a parallel of other things that are happening in the food industry across other geographic regions. So what I'm going to talk about today is a project called Huertas, and Huertas predates my tenure at Vermont. It was actually pitched to me by Pablo Bose during my job interview. It's like, if you get this job, you could maybe get involved with this really cool project. And it happened that I got the job, so now I get to work with this cool project, which makes me very happy. So Huertas is a project that was sort of propelled by Naomi Wolcott-McCausland, who works with the Bridges to Health program at UVM Extension and is also a master's student in CDAE here. And in partnership with Naomi, as well as a fantastic volunteer, Jessie Mazar, who started volunteering with us as an undergraduate student and never quite left after she graduated. I think that this is actually what's keeping her in Vermont. We've been working on this project over the last 4 years. I've been involved for 2 years. To connect farm workers in the state to the things that they need to plant gardens. So if that's seeds, if that's starts, if it's the permission to till up a piece of land next to a cow barn, the project is really sort of serving as a bridge to make that a possibility. This year we planted 25 gardens, ranging from a few tomato plants to 5 gardens, probably all total the size of this room. And really what we're looking at this project as is a way to connect people with culturally appropriate, local and fresh food. And I think that when we talk about food insecurity and food security, we don't often go into that piece of culturally appropriate and what people actually want to be eating and what people really miss from home. And so that's been a big emphasis for our project in terms of connecting with people with that very particular herb that is missing from a particular dish that reminds them of home. So my role has been really to support student volunteers to plant some gardens, to harvest some gardens, to do some sort of preliminary analysis of the success of this project. And over the last 18 months, we've been doing a lot of site visits to understand how these gardens are sort of impacting household food security, as well as sort of the broader migrant community, mostly working in Franklin County. Although we've kind of franchised in a way, and there's a similar group working in Addison County now as well. So that's kind of exciting. So today I'm going to talk about 3 particular gardeners that we've been working with and share some of their stories with them. These pictures that I'm going to be showing are their property of UVM extension. We have releases from all the gardeners to work with. I will be using pseudonyms. But I'm going to talk through a little bit about what I've seen in these particular spaces, what I draw from them as an anthropologist that gets really excited about food, and what I think this maybe how it pushes us to think about these ideas of local food or these ideas of sort of health, okay? So the first garden that I'm going to talk about is garden one of the 5 gardens that is cultivated by an individual named Tomas. And Tomas is a fascinating person. He is a farmer. And I think often this sort of line between gardener and farmer is a really hazy one. He came into the United States with a really strong farming background, and I think he was actually gardening before we ever were involved, but our project has sort of worked to connect him with a few things that he was missing. So essentially what happens every time we visit him is we know to clear out our back seat and we know to clear out our stomachs because he's going to feed us and he's going to send us home with a lot of food, and which is awesome on many levels. And it's interesting because he often refers to these gardens as, oh, I'm just feeding myself. This is just myself, But the food that he grows is enough to feed probably 20 people. Maybe not 20, but pretty good meal for 20 people. So this is more than just food security. This is about cultivating a sense of home. This is about building an environment where he feels very comfortable and happy, right? That I think gardens are a source of happiness that we're only sort of beginning to understand. And what I think is really sort of illustrative, and as a social scientist, I have to throw out a little bit of theory, that this idea that Gustavo Esteve uses of this distinction between comida and alimento, which he argues that in the United States with our industrial food system, that we've really lost a sense of comida, which is sort of food in place or food with a lot of connection. To me, this is all about comida, that he is saving seeds from year to year, he's planting varieties that he is really wanting to have around him, and he's packing up vegetables and sending them to his children at times. So there's something about this particular food that he finds very powerful, and it's been really fun over the past couple of years to experience the work that he's doing. So one of the things I think really sticks out is that we have this sort of exciting local food movement. Things are happening, there's all kinds of excitement around rebuilding local food systems, but that discussion is often very sort of oriented towards particular communities, and that oftentimes individuals who have a tremendous amount of knowledge about agroecology, about subsistence farming, about intercropping, all of these things are not actually considered in these movements. So to me, the sort of question is like, what would our local food movement look like if Tarsi was helping to guide it, right? Or is he really helping to guide it and we don't listen enough? So as an anthropologist, in the future, what I really want to think about is how does this fit into questions of food security for him? Why does he grow so much food? And why does he happen to always have fresh blackberries, or not fresh, but frozen, not in the winter, to give to people? That there's something about this sort of gift economy that's really, really big for him. The second gardener I'd like to talk about is a woman named Huertas. And Huertas was not a first-time gardener, but the garden that she started out with was a very sort of unplanned for, or at least, let's say, innovative and sort of spontaneous garden. That it started out as sort of a bunch of earth, a bunch of soil, we won't call it dirt, a bunch of soil that was put in a place, and over the past 2 years, it's turned into this large raised bed system that, she's been trying to grow garlic over winter. And what is really, I think, illustrative about her experience is that prior to becoming involved in this project, there really wasn't anywhere for her to go outside, or not really a need to go outside. And that the garden that she's working in is actually one of those few places where she feels very comfortable being outside. But because of the proximity to the border, there's questions that we have to consider about the garden's placement and about the kinds of things that she's able to experience. So with her young daughter, who's grown considerably over the last year, she goes outside, at least 2 to 3 times a day, she tells us, to get these chilies, to make these dishes from home that really are very exciting to her, and that there was a big sense of sort of lacking these dishes before she was able to go outside and pick the vegetables that she knew how to grow and how to prepare. So what we've seen over the last couple of years is this garden growing really immensely. That on the left, your left, is a jalapeno plant, and she's not much shorter than me. So we're talking about a very large jalapeno plant here. And the knowledge around growing this food and the thriving nature of this food is really, really impressive. And as we talked about this summer, that there's definitely a prioritization around food for this garden, that when we went and planted, it was, we were like, oh, here's some flower seeds, we've got some flowers. She's like, no, those just take up space and shade out everything else. What I want is food. I want chilies, and I want radishes, and I want the things that I'm gonna eat. And there's definitely a sense of how important this is in terms of food security and in terms of having not just food, but the kinds of foods that she wants. The third gardener that I'd like to talk about is a woman named Juana. And she was a first-time gardener last year, but despite that, it was probably one of the most impressive gardens that we have seen. And that, I think I often have had the assumption that if people are moving in from Mexico, that they're farmers, they know what they're doing. And this actually wasn't the case for her, that she had, had some experience with sort of an agrarian lifestyle, but she had never actually grown intensively an amount of food for herself. So despite being a first-time gardener, she was amazingly successful with her garden. And one of her sort of secret wishes was that if she just grew enough vegetables, her husband and her children would start eating them a little bit more. And so sort of as mothers do, she really wants to emphasize the healthy nature of that food and get it in their bellies as many ways as possible. And so she's had great success with that. And while we were visiting this past year, we had a chance to make chili rellenos from the chilies that she's growing, and they were wonderfully delicious. So over the past 18 months, Jessie Mazar, who is our program assistant, has gone back multiple times with live chickens that quickly become chicken mole, and with a sort of a desire to maintain these connections over even the winter season, which is often where we see food insecurity becoming really, really important for migrant populations around the country. So in terms of sort of what I'm learning from this experience, it's this idea that women experience migration much differently, and that when we think of households and how the reproductive labor and the labor associated with cooking often falls to women, food takes on a sort of a different meaning when you have a household with a mother in it or a household without a mother in it, and that those sort of symbols and those meanings that we attach to food look a lot different for migrant households if there are women present. And I think that this is something that people have looked at in various places, but I think here where there's so little access, that's really key. So to sort of sum up a little bit, to think about this, Vermont's a really rural place. All of us know that. And it's also very sort of isolating, right? And that what I'm sensing through this project is that there's these connections between small villages in Chiapas, Mexico, and rural Vermont that maybe are stronger than we might understand, and that the people that are working our working landscape still maintain connections with home, and that food is a really important part of doing that, that recreating meals that are more than just fulfilling, that they're actually sort of satiating, that there is something really important happening here. And so over the coming years, what I really want to think about is that within sort of Vermont and New England more broadly, we don't have a sense of the food security rates of migrant workers. We know a lot about healthcare access. We know, some degrees of other things, but the rates at which people go hungry or don't go hungry are not really well understood. And I think what I'd like to do is to build that understanding, but also go beyond that, because the ways that we understand food security are often really quantitative. They're really about, percentage-wise. But that doesn't capture all of this. That doesn't capture the really elaborate ways that people go about getting food, preparing particular dishes, or navigate environments. And so as an anthropologist, those are the things I'm really fascinated by. And hopefully in conjunction with collecting some of this food security data, I also am going to collect more information about how people navigate this environment and what's preventing people from accessing the food that they would like to. A lot of that isn't necessarily money. A lot of it is transportation and about getting to the places that people would like to get to. So I will be following up with that over the coming years, and I look forward to hearing or to telling you more about it. But just to do some acknowledgements, really like to acknowledge the gardeners that we're working with. It's been a lot of fun visiting, and many good meals have taken place. Also like to thank my collaborators, Naomi, who's here, and Jesse, who might be coming pretty soon, as well as all the donors. We've been really fortunate to build a connection with places like Digger's Mirth, who grow massive amounts of tomatoes for us and all kinds of good things. And people have given a lot of support to this project that I think without it, we wouldn't be sort of where we're at now. And also we got a small grant from the Vermont Community Foundation last year, which was really helpful in keeping Jessie around, and we're working really, really hard to keep her here and maybe applying to a graduate program so we can keep her fully funded, is the idea. So thank you so much. Pablo's going to talk, and then I think we're going to take questions after that.
So I'd like to thank the Fleming Museum and the Center for Research on Vermont for inviting us to give this talk. It's been a real pleasure also working with Teresa over the last few years. We've been collaborating not only on some of this research, but also on a project on food security and resiliency in Chittenden County. Also this past summer, Teresa co-organized a fantastic workshop on gender, food, and work, which some of this collaboration has really helped me to rethink many of the aspects of this research as well. What I'll be talking about today is a refugee farming project here in Vermont. My work, I'm not a food researcher per se, I'm more of a scholar of migration, but I became more and more interested in this food research as I got settled here in Vermont. I moved here from much larger kind of metropolitan areas, and that's really the type of research I did. I did work on immigrants in gateway cities. So I was coming from Toronto, New York, London, cities in the global south, and then I found myself in Burlington. And since I'm really committed to community-based research, I wasn't sure exactly where I was going to find these communities to work with. And then I found this refugee program. A really, really interesting program. And so my own work has shifted over the last 5-6 years to looking at migration to non-traditional destinations. And this is something that's true of migration in the US in general. If you look at patterns, we see much, much larger flows of migrants to the South, to the Midwest, to kind of secondary cities, not just Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, the traditional gateways, but to many other regions. This is also true of refugees. Refugees are quite different from, the mass of those migrants primarily still are Latino migrants, labor migrants who are going to places like Nashville, throughout the kind of rural regions, not only for agriculture, but also for working in hospitality industries, Colorado. There's all sorts of really interesting flows. But those are all migrants who are to some degree kind of not exactly voluntary, but they're going of their own accord. What I've been interested in is the fact that we see more and more refugees who are placed by the state, that they are going to these places like Burlington. Burlington is representative in a lot of ways of many other small to mid-sized communities in the US. Over the last 10, 15 years, for example, if you look at New York City, there's been 8,000 refugees resettled in New York. There's been 9,000 resettled in Utica in the same period. In Los Angeles, there's been 1,900 resettled. In Burlington, close to 3,500. Right? So you have these very different and similar kinds of patterns, Bowling Green, Kentucky, Twin Falls, Idaho, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, in fact, one of the things we see if you look across the US right now. We have very, very interesting patterns of smaller cities and regions into which refugees are resettling. As part of this work, I'm interested in two things. One is, what is the impact on the refugees and the migrants of moving to these new places, and what is the impact that they are having on those places? So how are both people and place changing through this exchange, through this form of migration? I'm interested in this set of interactions in a number of different areas: employment, health, education, transportation, but also food and other forms of kind of cultural exchange have become especially significant to me. And in fact, continuing on with some of the urban work, I'm actually co-editing a volume on immigrant foodways within North American cities as well. But here in Vermont, when I came here and I found the refugee program, and I started to do research with them, there were a couple of things that I began to do work on. One was transportation. I'll talk about that more a little bit later on. But transportation in almost every refugee resettlement site I've been at is always a problem. And that's true in many different ways. For me, I've been really interested in this and how it affects the outcomes of resettlement. But the other thing I got really interested in was this, at the time, very new refugee agriculture program. And this was just starting just about when I first got here. And so over the last 5 years, I've been involved with this program called the New Farms for New Americans program. It's run by the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. And what I'll do today is I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the program, its evolution over time, some of the successes it's had, and some of the challenges it faces. It's in many ways going through a transition right now, and so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I've had the opportunity over the last 5 years as well to place several students as interns, so I've been collaborating with this program. I have been working with it, as I said, actually for more than 5 years, and then I guess 3 years into it, my wife became director of the program, so I got a whole other kind of perspective on it. So it's been a very interesting kind of window into this program for me. But I've also had the opportunity of not only placing several students as interns with the program, but also having several write theses, honors theses, and do other kind of studies with them. Really interesting range of different work, everything from assessing the kind of outcomes of the program in terms of the grants that have supported it, to the differences between farmers markets, participants selling in farmers markets, the different ones around Burlington, to the kind of non-economic benefits of the program, and a number of other things as well. So to talk a little bit about the importance, again, of food in this whole process, this quote here by Krishnendu Rai talks about the importance of food as part of a placemaking practice. He says, because it links the land to the hearth and the hearth to the heart through the mediation of produce. As Alice Waters, noted chef and culinarian, says, if you see the same ingredients every place you go, you lose a sense of time and place. Then nothing is special. That's exactly why immigrants crave some of the distinctive products of their homeland, notwithstanding time or place. Several years ago, I, along with my collaborator, Alicia Laramie, who's also my wife, who's also now director of the New Farms program, we did a study looking at, a kind of a preliminary study looking at migrants and food in terms of really what people were missing. And so we did a series of interviews. In that case, it was actually with migrant farm workers as well as refugees, and it was quite fascinating to look at and hear about some of the things that people were missing, what it meant to, quote, eat American, as many people told us, which for the most part seemed to be fast food of different kinds, where they were getting the foods that they could not otherwise access, whether it was from mobile tiendas in some cases, making long trips to Montreal, New York, Boston if possible, having people bring food. In the case of some of the refugees, bring seeds. They knew they had relatives coming in later trips, bringing seeds with them. In fact, some of the Vietnamese elders I worked with this spring, it was so interesting. They had these little packets of seeds that they were bringing back from trips from Vietnam. So different kinds of ways in which people were accessing food. And yet, one of the big problems there, and also actually the growth of kind of ethnic grocery stores or sections in grocery stores that were supposed to, you see in City Market, the Bhutanese rice and things like this. And yet, an especial dearth of fresh produce when it comes to that. That was really very clear. So clearly food plays a very important part for refugees and for other migrants, but I think about this a lot in terms of refugees. Those who come here, not only are you coming through a kind of torturous process, you're first forcibly displaced. Secondly, and that might be a temporary process or a fairly brief process, but it might be an extremely protracted one. In the case of the Bhutanese, Nepalis who are here, the Somali Bantu, many spent years, decades in refugee camps, where they were, and many of them had been farmers before, they were cut off of any kind of access to land. And so you have this sort of long period of both turmoil, but then kind of stasis. And then all of a sudden you come here to the US, and you get to the US, and it's hurry up and get adjusted. You have 8 months to get adjusted. You have 8 months of direct support. You've got to get a job. You've got to learn the language. Everything has to happen right away. In the midst of all that turmoil, I think food and other forms of kind of cultural tradition take on even greater significance. They're a way of connecting to familiarity, to comforts. I don't want to romanticize them necessarily, but I think that there are specific things that people can identify with. There are specific ways in which food can provide those sorts of connections. Interestingly, this New Farms for New Americans program is not necessarily trying to fill that particular gap in the migration process. Much like many of the other refugee farming programs in the US, it's had, there are in fact a number of different reasons that this might be something that's taken up. This is a list of just some of the refugee farming programs. As you see, they're spread out throughout the country. Most of them are run, as with this one run by the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. They're run either by a resettlement agency or by a mutual aid association, a community association, in some cases community groups, often assisted by a university or some other agricultural college, something that's providing some technical assistance. The majority of these projects, I would say, are community gardening projects. A lot of them are urban in focus, and as I said, their motivations are quite disparate. So in some cases, they might be around simply providing the foods that people don't have access to, especially culturally appropriate foods. In some cases, they have much more of a training component. And that's really the genesis of the New Farms for New Americans program. The idea there, the original director of the New Farms program, Josie Weldon, when I interviewed her, and we talked about, what lay behind this idea. In many ways, it seemed to make sense. Vermont is an agricultural landscape. You have refugees who are coming in. Many of them have agricultural knowledge. Here's a great way to marry those two things. But what was interesting when she talked about this, Josie had actually come here as an AmeriCorps volunteer. She was working with the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program, and she was actually working on micro-enterprise, like whatever the micro-loan program was. This is what produced Samosa Man, et cetera. And what she found was that it was, and at the time, what you really saw was the majority of the refugees in Vermont right then were African refugees. And they were overwhelmingly, the participants in these programs, the microenterprise programs, were men. And so there were a lot of women, and in the Somali Bantu community especially, that she was seeing who were not participating in the program and who were at home. And she saw this as being kind of doubling their sense of isolation. And so she envisioned this program at its outset as a way of, yes, building on those skills, yes, providing this kind of culturally appropriate foods, but also as a form of workforce training and of building kind of social inclusion for these women. So the first participants in this program, there were 15. I believe it was 12 Somali Bantu women and 3 Burundians. And from that program, it's grown considerably. And that's part of what I'd like to talk about is the actual evolution of the program. So New Farms for New Americans, as I said, really starts off in this relatively limited fashion. It's a small number of people, and the idea is provide people with the kind of training that will allow them to become independent farmers, to be successful independent farmers here in Vermont. The notion was that you would go through 3 different stages. You would have, or 3 different tiers. There are community gardeners, there are market gardeners, and there are independent farmers. The idea is at the end of this process, you'll be an independent farmer. The community gardeners, again, it's just kind of growing food for yourself, maybe getting somewhat familiarized with the growing seasons, crops, et cetera. Here, the market gardener program is in many ways the emphasis of the program. That's where much of the training was focused, and so it would be over the winter you would have classes. The Intervale provided a lot of the technical assistance to begin with. Now it's transitioned much more to assistance from extension, UVM extension. But the idea was you'd take classes, and the classes would be in a number of different things. Actually, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But the evolution of the program has seen it kind of expand and then settle in different kinds of ways. So it's gone from being those 15 farmers to second year, there was 25, I believe. The third year, it expanded across all 3, so there were close to 100 farmers in those 3 different categories. And by the 4th year, it had shifted around a little bit. Not everybody, it was clear, really wanted to be an independent farmer at the end. It was clear that some people really wanted to be community gardeners. Some people really wanted only a part of the package of the market gardener skills. And so it's shifted around quite a bit. This program, as with all the other ones that I listed across the US, was supported by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is an office in the Agency of Human Services, Health and Human Services. Fairly large grant. It supported the project for 5 years. And it's interesting because the grant is not coming from the USDA. It's coming from Office of Refugee Resettlement. Their main focus is employment. And so that's kind of what structured this program in some ways. Most of those other programs have also gotten, as New Farms has gotten, they've gotten some foundation funding, they've gotten other forms of funding to supplement this as well. But it's shifted in different ways. And now as the program funding comes to an end, you can only get one of these grants. So at the end of the 5 years, you don't have that support anymore. So you have to figure out what you're going to do after that. It's fairly significant support. So absent that, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? And so really this past couple of years has been thinking about what happens at the end of this grant. Do you have independent farmers at the end of this grant? Is this a training program that continues on, and so forth? As I said, training has been a really big part of this, and that's included not only learning about crops, when to harvest them, how to harvest them. In Vermont, you have these classes in the winter as well on everything from farm management, budgeting. They do English language classes with farm-specific English language training that Vermont Adult Learning provides. And they also provide other forms of training. So there's food safety training for those who are going to be preparing food. That's part of the CSA that I'll talk about in a moment. So there's a number of different training and education programs that, that the New Farms program offers. So in its mission, not only as a workforce program, but also as a social enterprise. This is one of the reasons that the English language classes are so significant as well. So some of the activities that the program does in addition to this kind of training, they ran, and this ramped up from when they had 15 farmers to when they had 100, and now it's kind of ramped back down a little bit. But they had a CSA, and the CSA offered not only a basket of produce, but they also, its kind of innovation was that it offered prepared foods as well. And it offered prepared foods, so I think I actually got involved with this because I signed up for the CSA the first year, and they had this prepared food, and it was glorious, and it has been glorious throughout. And getting different kinds of food, some of which, and it's actually been really interesting because Josie and then Alicia have both been providing newsletters with stories about farmers, but also with recipes. There's vegetables in the packets that I have no idea what they are or how one would use them. And finding different kinds of foods. This year and Teresa gets the CSA as well, we got this this food. It was almost like a pakora with a dip, and it was very Indian in many ways, but I didn't know what it was, and it was actually a Somali delicacy, which comes from the coasts, which makes perfect sense. So anyway, so the CSA is a big one, and the market gardeners are the ones who provide the food for the CSA, and so they have a special set of training components there. It's not simply what are we going to grow in our gardens, in our farms, and let's just pick it and we'll throw it into the CSA. It obviously needs much more careful planning. And that's where the assistance of the Intervale came in especially handy. They also had farm stands, and these farm stands were in different places, but most notably, a couple of years ago, they got a special grant to provide both produce and prepared foods at a farm stand on King Street, with the idea that this would also be improving food security in that region. So that was an interesting experiment as well. It wasn't repeated this year due to resources. And they also sell at a couple of different farmers markets. So 2 years ago, again, when the program was at its height, it was selling at the Old North End Farmers Market, the New North End Farmers Market, and Winooski Farmers Market. Not the Burlington Farmers Market, for all sorts of reasons around expense and because it's a tourist fair, et cetera. There's many different reasons. And then the other thing that's really significant about the activity of the New Farms program is produce to take home. This is a really, really big part of this. When the program started, because of the way in which it was framed as a workforce development program, you could not take produce home. You could not grow produce for yourself. If you did, you'd get kicked out of the program. But as it expanded, as they got more land, they started off on, I believe, 1 acre at the Intervale. But it expanded as it moved to the Ethan Allen Homestead. And they've had an excellent partnership with the Winooski Valley Park District. And it moved to 6 acres. At that point, they basically, the front, I think 3 acres was for the market garden, and the rest was for themselves to grow different produce. And as we found in our research, that became a really, really important part of it. As I said before, the current status of this project is it's in a state of flux. It has, or not flux, but more transition. In many ways, this is responsive to the actual migrant flows, the refugee flows you find within Burlington, who might be participants in this program. So as I said, this program really gets off the ground in 2007, 2008. From 2008 to now, the biggest group of refugees who've resettled in Burlington are not Africans, but Bhutanese. So you've had 1,500 Bhutanese resettle in Burlington over that period, in Vermont over that period. So different food tastes, different desires. 2 years ago, a number of the elders in the Bhutanese community who'd also been participants in this program came to the managers and said, you know what we'd really like to do is grow some rice. So 2 years ago, they did a little bit of research, again with UVM Extension, with some of the rice growers who are here. There's a few rice growers here in Vermont, found out that there's a hardy Japanese variety that'll grow here. So they went and they grew a little bit of rice. They then harvested and replanted in a larger, basically created a paddy down at the Ethan Allen homestead. And then this year they harvested that. And they harvested that. I was present for the harvest. It was absolutely fascinating seeing them harvesting it, and it was a kind of a show. There was lots of media there, and lots of people were there to watch it. But the farmers themselves were a little bit disappointed. They said that normally we would wait, we would cut this, we would let it dry, so it's actually much easier to harvest rather than doing this kind of for show. Anyway, so, but the idea is that they'll replant that. They're not going to actually use that rice this year, but they'll save that and they'll replant it next year, and then they'll have a truly big harvest. When I ask them what they want to do with it, because of course, there's all sorts of things. Well, you could sell it to City Market, you could sell it to this, you could sell it to that. Their main desire is to use it for their own communities. So, and that's a theme that comes up again and again and again. There is clearly an interest in moving towards more of a community gardening model, I would say, amongst participants in the New Farms program. I said before some of the challenges around the changing migrant flows. In a place like Vermont, you have, we take in 325 refugees a year. Compare that to California, where you have 13,000. But they're concentrated in really a couple of towns here. They're not really in Vermont. They're really in Chittenden County, and within Chittenden County, they're in Burlington, Winooski, et cetera. And so the relative impact is considerably different, and we reflect federal priorities in lots of ways. So whereas if you go to Dearborn or you go to St. Louis, you go to St. Louis, there's many, many Bosnians. You go to Dearborn, there's many Iraqis. You go to Southern California, lots and lots of Southeast Asians. There's much more of a clustering and kind of the traditional immigrant enclaves. Here we have much more reflection of the broader refugee migration patterns. So the last 10 years, we've had groups who've been coming in who've had agricultural backgrounds. What happens if the next group of refugees who come don't have an agricultural background? Would they want to be involved in this program? Who would want to be involved in this program? So those are some of the things that we've been thinking through. When thinking about the success of the program, one of the things that really stands out is that the economic benefits are not really the major drivers for people. And that's not surprising because they don't really make much money. It's really, for the amount of work, it's not that much money. But overwhelmingly, some of the things that people talked about, it was taking food home. That was the biggest one. Being able to have fresh produce, especially culturally appropriate produce. So for the Bhutanese, daikon radish and snake gourd. For some of the African farmers, machacha, I can't remember, it's machicha, something like that. There's a bunch of different things that were really important. Tyler Wilkins-Ray, who's worked with us on this program, did a great study in which he had several farmers weigh what they took home every month as opposed to what they were harvesting for sale. And we found it was 4 times as much. So really quite significant. So some of the challenges, as I said, the changing population is a big one. The switchover in funding is a big one. Transportation, I put this up because this is the major barrier to people actually getting to the sites in which people are going to be farming. So the Intervale, Ethan Allen, how do you actually get down there? And right now, and I've been pressed into service the last 2 years, I drive that van quite often in the summer and pick up refugees in the Old North End and Winooski and drive them down, and that's not a particularly efficient system. And so these kinds of things, the actual difficulties of farming, and I think that's one of the big things a program like this has to ask. You are faced with refugee populations who are trying to make an adjustment to Vermont as a whole, to life in the US as a whole. It's very, very hard work to be a farmer who is born and raised here. To think that we would have an expectation of refugees resettling in Vermont that they would be independent farmers within 5 years, within 3 years, I think is a lot to ask. So those are some of the challenges. I know I'm kind of over time, so I'm just going to end up here. So I'd like to thank Association of Africans Living in Vermont, both of the last two directors and the farmers. So thank you. Can we just stand?
We'll just stand. Yeah. Well, anyway. So I think we have some time for questions or comments or, good recipes. We probably each have a few.
Do we have to take questions from Luis?
Yes, we have to take a question from Luis.
All right.
I won't ask the expected question about why aren't they riding bicycles?
I will answer that because we get that all the time, but okay.
Okay. Well, actually, this has to do with food security, right? Food security is a bureaucratized kind of language, right? And I'm wondering what kinds of idioms do, the communities that you're working with actually use? And is there a gap between our sort of notion of what food security is and our attempts, as you say, Teresa, to quantify it, and then now we want to qualify it, but what are the gaps between that and the ways that these communities are actually talking about this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, food security is definitely sort of a governmentalized, and I think there's some power to that term in that most of the individuals that we're working with, they talk about it as hunger. They talk about it as hambre, and that food security, there's a lot of controversy over the use of that term, the changing of that term in terms of the USDA definitions. But one of the biggest things is that food security allows us to think about not just right now, but what's happening in the future. And so I kind of keep all of those terms on the table, and that when I talk to people, I don't say, so what is your level of food security? That doesn't ring true. But I think that, there is something about ways of crafting questions that, do you know that you have food next week, that are captured in how the USDA studies food security, that I think is really helpful. I tend to use sort of at least the spirit, if not the exact definition of the community food security idea, that is food that is culturally familiar, healthy, that is obtained with dignity, and that to me is sort of a much more comprehensive understanding. But yeah, people don't talk about, we don't say, I have very high food security. That's not a term that we relate to. So usually it's hunger.
And I would say that there's no equivalent. Mm-hmm. There's nothing that sort of mirrors that. That said, basically people talk about the value of this in having fresh produce. Mm-hmm. I hear that a lot. Yep. But also things that they can't get otherwise, or that are, and not just for kind of food reasons, but cultural reasons. So the goat project, for example, is important because the Bhutanese want goat meat, but also goat for festivals, things like this. What was interesting for me is that most of the farmers wouldn't express, in my case, wouldn't express the hunger issue, but we also found most of the farmers give away their food or give away some element of their produce to not just extended family, but to neighbors. And it's, I would say it's clear from some of my other research that there are hunger issues amongst elements of the refugee community, and this goes to creating more community resources. Yeah. I do want to answer the bike question for a sec, just because you know, I was down at Winooski Valley Park District talking about this issue because it's, you know, the VNA brings people down and there's, you know, there's all these different things. And we had someone from Locomotion saying, well, you know, let's get bikes down there. And, or, you know, there's bike trails and you can get down there. In the case of these programs, not only do you have, you're talking about farmers with implements and with, you know, bags of produce, et cetera. The majority of the participants right now in the New Farms program are 55 and older. And so there's other issues around mobility that I think really come into play. It's not, if we didn't pick people up and bring them, they wouldn't come. They couldn't come. And so that's you know, I had the one experience of one farmer who was walking with his developmentally disabled grandson down like Route 127, whatever. He's just walking on the side of the road. And so the police stopped him, and he doesn't speak any English. And so they went through this long back and forth, and he just kept saying potato, because he had this sack of potatoes. And finally, I mean, I don't know why it took them so long to figure out he was a farmer. Anyway, then they gave him a ride down to the farm. But you know, it's a serious issue.
Yeah. Other questions? Comments?
So you guys touched upon a little bit of the transportation issue and how it was not about money and it was more about transportation and eating locally, and how you said that your van was not like very efficient. And I was just wondering if you could touch upon your transportation and how eating locally kind of fit into that, and if you had any ideas on being more efficient with the van, if you ever thought of like biking or anything of that sort.
Yeah, I mean, I thought, you know, the lack of efficiency with the van was also just, I'm thinking I'm like driving around picking up all these people from all these different places. It was time consuming, but it was also, I mean, it was wasteful in all sorts of different ways. But I think that it just, I don't know what some of the other alternatives necessarily are. You know, we've approached CCTA. The interesting thing is, at least for the Ethan Allen site, I think that's where some of the bus drivers go to have their downtime, because we find buses parked down there and drivers sleeping like when they have their off time. So it's kind of ironic that there are actually buses down there, but they weren't taking anyone down. So, I mean, that was clearly a big issue for me. You had a different transportation.
Yeah, I mean, the transportation issue for us has been really, really significant in that, you know, even just being in public is a cause for concern, and that we have had a lot of struggles about deciding about, you know, we would love to have huge community events all the time and bring people in and bring people together for meals, but the transportation issues have been pretty significant in that how would people get there? That, again, you know, we do have a new licensing bill that opens up licenses for all residents in the state of Vermont, but that is going to be a slow process if, you know, it completely sort of takes hold. That, you know, we've done what we can, and especially thinking about the seasonal nature of this project, that this is, you know, happening 2.5 months over the course of a summer. This year we got started very late because of the rain, but that I think if we had a better sense of and a better sort of transportation network, that this would have the potential to not be sort of just kitchen gardening, but it could be sort of a broader food security thing that also brings people together. But it's very difficult. We've had some really great events, but we always have to be very careful about the transportation and how we're bringing people together. So, other questions? I have students. We could award extra credit for questions. Yeah.
I guess I have one question. So you mentioned that a lot of people were more interested in being involved as kind of a community gardening thing, and also given what you said about some of the participants being over 55, and that it's a lot to expect that people might become full-time farmers within a few years of moving here. One of the criticisms I've heard of New Farmers for New Americans in the food and farming community is that the model of small farming that they would be striving towards, sort of undifferentiated, diversified vegetable farms, isn't really profitable for anyone at the moment. And whether that's something that people want to put 5 years into working towards, when maybe that's not a model that the state in general is.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that, you know, again, I just skimmed through what the motivations that people had for participating. It was bringing home food that they wanted. Income actually, while it was, I think, the second most chosen overall, but it really wasn't that high. There were other benefits like being outside, being able to be interacting with other people in their community, interacting with people in the broader community. There were all of these non-economic benefits. And so this really begged the question of like, what are we doing? Like, why is this program structured in this way? One of my students, Julia Panopoulos, wrote a fantastic thesis where she looked not only at new farms, but at a number of these this is Refugee Agricultural Program project something. You know, and the way those are structured, as with most refugee funding, is you got to pay for yourself. How are you going to pay for yourself? You're not going to pay for yourself just by being community minded, by growing stuff in a community garden. That's a hobby. That's not real. And so in order to legitimize yourself for these kinds of grants, you really have to say, even in the small scale grants, I've seen, why are you going to grow rice? Not because it's culturally appropriate, but because you can sell it to city market. So unfortunately, the way in which many of the structures are set up, the only way you can justify it is by saying, this is what you're going to, it's going to make some kind of economic benefit. But I think you're exactly right that if you ask the refugees today what it is that they want out of a program like this, that's a big hole. Would it change if you had a different age group? I don't know, mainly because we don't have those age groups participating in these programs. You know, it's not people in their 20s who want to be part of this. And that's a bigger actual question and anxiety that I've heard among some of the farmers are around the loss of agricultural knowledge, cultural agricultural knowledge, if their kids aren't interested and their grandkids aren't interested. I think the schools are actually doing some very interesting work around that in connecting some of the grandparents with kids in their kind of gardening classes and things like that. So I don't know if that exactly answered, but I agree with your critique.
Okay, I think, thank you both very much. That was great. It was so interesting.
Thank you, Teresa.